Okay, so today let me go over the anatomy of the skull. I'm going to go over each of the bones and each of the structures associated with each of those bones that you need to know for this class. Okay, so first let's start with the cranial bones. You've got your frontal bone here, your two parietal bones, your sphenoid bone, temporal bone, and the occipital bone. The occipital bone is very large, and it includes all of this area here around the magnum foramen. So all of this is occipital bone. Okay, so this is the frontal bone. The structures that you need to know that are associated with the frontal bone only include the frontal sinuses, which is only viewable with this sagittal section of the skull. So here we have our sagittal section, and this area here would be the frontal sinus. So this is the frontal bone, and the structure here is the frontal sinus of the frontal bone. We have the two parietal bones. Okay. Now, the parietal bones are separated with the sagittal suture, and they are also bordered with the coronal suture, which is shown here. So this is the coronal suture. Coronal suture and sagittal suture. For the temporal bone, which is shown here, the temporal bone has several structures you need to know. There is a suture that runs horizontally. This is the squamosal suture. Squamosal suture. Another feature that the temporal bone has is right here where it articulates with the jawbone. The indentation here that is on the temporal bone, this is the mandibular fossa. The mandibular fossa is the articulation point for the mandibular condyle, which is on the mandible or jaw bone. Right here. This is the external auditory meatus, otherwise known as the acoustic canal or the external auditory canal. So this is also considered to be a structure of the temporal bone. So this portion here is still considered part of the temporal bone, and this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So that is another structure of the temporal bone that you need to know. Okay. Now, there's another structure that you need to know that is part of the temporal bone, and that is the internal auditory meatus. Okay, so here is the external auditory meatus that I showed you earlier. Okay, and this travels quite a distance actually through the bone, and it will come out in a small structure right there. So this is the internal auditory meatus. So this is the internal auditory meatus. Okay. And that is the bone associated with that is still the temporal bone, even though now we're on the inside of the skull. Okay. Okay, so temporal bone, we've got your squamosal suture, your zygomatic process of the temporal bone. We've got your external auditory meatus, your, where did it go? There we go. Your internal auditory meatus, there and there. Okay. And your mandibular fossa, which is the indentation for the articulation point of the jaw. Okay. Next, let's look at the sphenoid bone and the structures associated with the sphenoid bone. So, from the outside, the sphenoid bone is going to lie over the area where you have your temple, and it's going to be in front of the temporal bone. It's going to be this area right here. It's also going to be underneath the squamosal suture. Okay. So this is the sphenoid bone. When we take an internal view of the sphenoid bone, we can really see it in all of its glory. Okay. The sphenoid bone includes this area right here, which kind of looks like a happy face to me, like that would be an eye, that would be an eye, and there's a little smiley face here. And then it has these wings, these winged structure. So if you were to just isolate the area of the sphenoid bone, you would see this butterfly shape. Okay, there are a couple of structures that are part of the sphenoid bone that you need to know. The first one is if you go right in the middle of the happy face, there is actually a little chamber right here. Let me see if I can give you guys a close-up there. Okay, so if you could imagine this is an eye, and that's an eye, and this is a little smiley face. Right here, there's a little chamber. This chamber is called the sella turcica. Now, the sella turcica is a little chamber that houses your pituitary gland, which lies at the inferior most point of that section of the brain. Okay, so there would be the sella turcica. Okay, also associated with the sphenoid bone would be your optic foramen. Okay. Plural would be optic foramina. So this here, actually gonna try to stick my stick through it. There we go. So this right here would be the optic foramen. Okay. And the optic foramen comes out here. And so basically the eyeballs that I pointed out to you earlier on my imaginary moth or butterfly of the sphenoid bone, these would be the optic foramen, or I could say optic foramina for being plural. Okay. Next, let's go ahead and look at the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone has a lot of wonderful features from a few different viewpoints. So we're going to start with the viewpoint where we're just looking up the nasal region here of our skeleton. All of these structures that we see here inside of the nose are all part of the ethmoid bone. These are all part of the ethmoid bone. When you look very closely, this one doesn't have it quite as pronounced as some other ones do. There are some round structures that are on the walls of the nasal cavity here. Those would be the nasal concha. Concha meaning shell, because they kind of look shell-like. Area here would be the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So the sagittal section is the only section of the skull that you would be able to identify the ethmoid sinuses. Much of it has been broken off. However, you can see here some very thin, brittle, honeycomb-like structures. Okay, so these structures here, that would be the ethmoid sinuses. The ethmoid sinuses of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so up here you have a comb-like structure that is protruding upwards or superiorly. Okay. So this whole area that I'm outlining right here is still ethmoid. So this is still the ethmoid bone. Okay. The structure here right in the middle that is more pronounced, that is going to be the crista galli. Crista galli, which means rooster comb. And then the areas on the left and right sides of the crista galli, you're going to have the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate on either side. And that would be the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone and the crista galli of the ethmoid bone. So this region back here, this is the occipital bone. Okay. And this suture here that lines the occipital bone is the lambdoidal suture. The lambdoidal suture. And you might recall that the occipital bone is deceivingly large because as we look inferiorly, all of this area as well is all also going to be the occipital bone. Okay. There are two more structures you need to know associated with the occipital bone. This hole here, this is the foramen magnum, meaning large hole. This is the hole that your spinal cord travels through. Foramen magnum. So this would be the foramen magnum of the occipital bone. And there are two articulation points, one here and one here. And these are like little knuckles, if you will, that kind of protrude out. These are the occipital condyles, And these points are going to articulate with the C1 vertebrae so that your head can move around, which is always a good thing. So this is the jaw. Now, the jaw is called the mandible. Okay, so this is the mandible. And the mandible has a couple of features that you need to know about. Now, you might remember, let me just bring this back for a second. You might remember that we talked briefly before about the mandibular fossa, and the mandibular fossa is this indentation right here that articulates with the jaw, right? So this is the mandibular fossa articulates with the mandibular condyle, which is actually this protruding point here on the mandible. Okay? So this is the mandibular condyle, and this on the temporal bone is the mandibular fossa. Okay, there's one more thing you need to know, which is the mandibular foramen. The mandibular foramen, you really need to have an unattached jawbone in order to really be able to see this. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to see this through the video. If not, when you look at it in person, it's pretty easy to tell. So if you look at an angle, actually, I can even put my stick right there. So that's kind of nice. All right. So this is the mandibular foramen. Okay, you have one on either side. So there's one there. So they kind of go at an angle. And your other one is the bones that you feel on your cheeks, here and here, these cheekbones. This area is the zygoma. They also call it the zygomatic bone or the zygoma. Okay, your cheekbones. The major area of the face here is going to be the maxilla. Now, the zygoma also has a process, right? Oops. So this is the zygoma, right? And you might remember that this right here is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay. Well, there's something similar going on here. We've got the zygomatic bone, which is protruding and having this process reaching back to the area of the temporal bone. So this is called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, or the temporal process of the zygoma. Okay, let's look at some more of these facial structures here. This would be your nasal bone, the nasal bone. Whereas this is your perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, which I mentioned before. This right here at the bottom is the vomer. That is the vomer. Okay, so I mentioned the vomer earlier, and let's go ahead and take another view of the vomer.
looking at it inferiorly here, this center structure here is the vomer. And then we can also see the maxilla and the palatine bone as well.
When you look inside of the orbital region, the bone that is inside of the orbital region, but very anterior here, this is your lacrimal bone. This is where your lacrimal gland, lacrimal duct that allows you to cry, which you might be wanting to cry right now, is located. So this is the lacrimal bone. Okay. So lastly, next we'll go ahead and take a look at the fetal skull. The skull of the fetus has some features that is not seen in the adult skull. And you can see a wonderful illustration of that here. So this is what's commonly known as a soft spot. So we always want to make sure we're careful of this area. The correct anatomical term for this is the anterior fontanelle. The anterior fontanelle. Okay. Now you also have this front area, which is the frontal suture. This is the frontal suture. Now, if I were to turn this around, we also have another soft spot that is less pronounced, but the bones are not fused yet here either. And this would be the posterior fontanelle. The posterior fontanelle. Okay. And the rest of this is very similar to the adults. You know, we've got our occipital bone, parietal bone, the temporal bone's really tiny and way down here, sphenoid, and this would be the frontal bone.